Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, and citizens who cherish both a free press and a functioning government, thank you for gathering today to consider a moment that, while news on the surface reveals something deeper about how we talk to one another when the stakes are high. Mike Johnson vs. Reporter, Shutdown Answers Under Pressure. This isn't just a headline, it's a window into the ritual of modern accountability, a speaker facing an insistent question, a reporter insisting on clarity, a nation listening for something more than slogans. In that tense exchange, we see the choreography of democracy, the microphone that invites scrutiny, the cameras that bring the scrutiny into our living rooms, the constitutionally protected questions that keep leaders honest, and the necessity for leaders to answer not as a favor to the press, but as a duty to the people. When the prospect of a government shutdown looms, every word matters. Agencies anticipate contingency plans, families wonder about paychecks and services, small businesses weigh contracts, travelers look at TSA lines, scientists monitor grants, veterans ask about benefits, and the nation calculates the price of delay. In such a moment, questions must be clear and answers must be candid. The reporter's job is not to flatter or to fight, but to focus, to press past fog to facts, past posture to plans. The speaker's job is not merely to defend a position, but to define it, not just to point to opposing parties, but to explain the path forward. Under pressure, our public language often shrinks to sound bites, yet the ramifications expand to touch every household. That is why the tone of the encounter matters. If the tone is contemptuous, trust erodes. If it is evasive, cynicism spreads. If it is earnest, even in disagreement, then we fortify the shared table at which a free people solve hard problems. Let us be plain about the stakes. A shutdown is not a theatrical device. It is a blunt instrument that bruises the very people who have the least cushion to absorb the blow. When leadership meets journalism at the hot edge of a deadline, the purpose is not to provide a spectacle, but to reveal substance. What bills are viable? What compromises are palatable? What priorities will be preserved? What timelines are realistic? And what are the red lines that, if held too tightly, become a knot no one can untie? In moments like this, words are bridges or barricades. The press can build a bridge by framing questions that illuminate. How will you protect pay for active duty military? What safeguards exist for food assistance and housing vouchers? Which policy riders are essential and which are bargaining chips? And the speaker can build a bridge by answering plainly, here is the bill text, here is the whip count, here is the sequencing of votes, here is what we will do if the Senate diverges, here is the plan for agencies if time runs out. Under pressure, clarity does not arrive by accident, it arrives by intention, and it inherits the moral weight of the moment. We can honor both roles, the persistence of the reporter and the responsibility of the speaker, while insisting that neither refuge in vagueness nor retreat into hostility will suffice. The American people deserve answers that can be carried home and tested against lived experience. Will the clinic stay open? Will the port continue operations? Will the ranger at the national park still greet families from around the world? Will the SBA loan still be processed? Will the food inspection proceed without interruption? The measure of leadership under pressure is not whether one parries a tough question, but whether one uses the question as a lever to move the public closer to understanding. And the measure of journalism under pressure is not whether one scores a viral moment, but whether the public emerges with a clearer map of the terrain. Tonight, as we consider that exchange, sharp, tense, imperfect, we are invited to reaffirm a simple democratic principle. Scrutiny is not sabotage. Accountability is not animosity, and when potential shutdowns threaten the ordinary cadence of American life, the extraordinary work of clear, courageous communication must prevail. Let us look directly at what answers under pressure should mean in practice, because it is here, on the nuts and bolts, that democratic confidence is either restored or further frayed. Pressure compresses time, and in the compression, leaders and journalists face a choice: to default to blame, which is easy, or to default to detail, which is hard. The right choice, especially with a shutdown on the horizon, is detail. That means laying out timelines that an ordinary person can follow. Which committee marks up what, which chamber moves first, which continuing resolution extends which accounts, what anomalies are contemplated for critical services, and where negotiations stand across the key appropriation clusters: defense, homeland security, labor, health, human services, transportation, housing, interior, environment, agriculture, and the rest. It also means translating the abstract into the immediate. What happens to a federal worker's paycheck on day 1 vs. day 10, how contractors are treated, what the trigger points are for back pay, what the ripple effects look like for local economies built around federal installations, and how federal, state partnerships, from Medicaid administration to SNAP to highway funds, are buffered or disrupted. The reporter's questions in such a crucible are not obstacles. They are instruments for making the plan legible. A speaker who meets that scrutiny with specifics: vote counts, bill text references, procedural options like suspension of the rules or structured rules from the Rules Committee, and honest assessments of cross-chamber differences, does more than score a press conference win. He models the civics we teach our children. The public does not demand perfection, but it does demand orientation. Where are we? What is next? What contingencies exist? And who is responsible for which decisions? Under pressure, the temptation is to cloak uncertainty in confident rhetoric. Resist it. Confidence without content is a promise without a plan. Content without confidence is a plan without a heartbeat. What we need, what a shutdown threat requires, is confident content. The poise to say, here is what we know, here is what we do not yet know, here is what we will do if X occurs, and here is how you can verify we did what we said. Verification is crucial. Tell the public where to read the bill summary, where to find the Congressional Budget Office estimate, which committee report to consult, and when the next briefing will occur. Invite error correction, furnish updates, explain trade-offs. And when a reporter asks a question that feels sharp or even adversarial, remember that the edge is often an attempt to pierce ambiguity. If the speaker can answer with calm specificity, acknowledging constraints, naming partners, and distinguishing between what is policy and what is politics, the nation benefits. In turn, reporters must also work under pressure with discipline, pressing for clarity without collapsing complex negotiations into false binaries, recognizing when a yes/no answer is appropriate, and when a process answer is the most honest available, and providing context so that viewers understand that a clean, continuing resolution versus one with policy riders is not merely a slogan contest, but a real choice with operational consequences for agencies and communities. None of this is glamorous. It is slower than the pace of social media and less dramatic than the cut and thrust of partisan theater. But it is how we keep faith with the people who do not have time to parse legislative language, who simply need to know whether the door to their child's Head Start classroom will open on Monday morning. Answers under pressure should stabilize, not inflame, inform, not obscure, and above all, they should be checkable by citizens who are the ultimate editors of our public life. If Mike Johnson, in that moment with the reporter, chooses that path of transparent detail, if the reporter, in that same moment, holds firm to questions that illuminate rather than merely irritate, then the story that follows will be better than any headline, a story in which, despite tension, the system remembers its purpose: to keep government by, for, and of the people, running with clarity, candor, and care. In the glare of Klieg lights and the relentless tick of a deadline, the exchange between a speaker and a reporter is not merely a duel. It is a diagnostic taking the vital signs of our civic body and telling us whether the institutions that are supposed to carry oxygen to every corner of the republic are, in fact, doing so. Consider the anatomy of such a moment. The questioner stands as a proxy for millions who cannot be in that hallway. The speaker stands as a steward of a chamber that controls the nation's purse strings. Between them lies a matrix of facts, timetables, parliamentary procedures, budget baselines, and human consequences. Shutdown answers under pressure are, at their core, an effort to convert complexity into a navigable path without committing the sin of oversimplification. Good answers acknowledge reality's granularity, that appropriations are not a monolith but a mosaic, that continuing resolutions are not a moral failing but a management tool, sometimes abused, sometimes necessary, that compromise is not capitulation, and that principles which cannot survive a question may not be principles at all, but slogans in disguise. The central leadership task here is to be intelligible without being reductive, to be forthright without being inflammatory, and to be responsive without chasing every provocation into a cul-de-sac of performative outrage. Under pressure, language tends to polarize, but the country needs it to clarify. So imagine a model response, the kind that treats citizens like adults. It would begin by naming the concrete stakes. Here are the accounts affected on day one. Here are the ones with unobligated balances that grant a brief glide path. And here are the statutory exceptions that ensure safety and national security functions continue. It would proceed to process, we have X vehicles on the floor calendar, Y in the Rules Committee queue, and Z under active negotiation with the other chamber and the White House. It would end with accountability. If we miss the date of November, we will execute contingency A. If the Senate toggles to position B, our fallback is C. Here is where you can read the memo we sent to agency heads. A response like that does not merely parry, it equips. It allows the public to aud, it rhetoric against reality, and to judge not only the what but the how. And to the reporter pressing on inconsistencies, yesterday you promised a clean measure. Today you floated policy riders. The healthiest answer is to surface the constraint. Our coalition is internally diverse. Here is what the conference will accept. Here is what is dead on arrival, and here is the delta we are trying to close. Such candor does not project weakness, it projects respect. Meanwhile, the press, acting in good faith, can calibrate its pressure to ferret out information rather than to manufacture drama. Ask for numbers, not vibes. Ask for dates, not adjectives. Ask for who, whips, what, not who owns whom. The public square is saturated with hot takes. It is starved for cold facts. And because shutdown brinkmanship can quickly become a hall of mirrors, each side accusing the other of theater, the corrective is traceability. Cite bill numbers, post-draft text, read scorekeeping tables aloud, and publish the procedural map that will shepherd a decision from committee room to resolute desk. Every time a leader answers with such crumbs, the country's collective literacy rises a notch, and the next crisis finds us a little less hostage to confusion. That is why the Johnson reporter tableau matters beyond any single policy clause. It is a chance to normalize an ethic of precision under pressure. Precision, in turn, dignifies the anxious viewer, the federal worker refreshing email for furlough instructions, the parent wondering if WAC benefits will hiccup, the Coast Guard spouse calculating rent against delayed pay, the small town mayor checking whether a grant drawdown will stall a water project mid-ditch. In their name, we should renounce the glamour of vagueness. We should insist that the temperature of our talk be lower than the temperature of our timelines, and that when the countdown is real, our sentences are real too. If we can achieve that, if a speaker makes complexity legible, and a reporter makes power answerable, then answers under pressure become something more than a defensive maneuver. They become the Republic's renewable resource. Clarity, of course, none of this unfolds in a vacuum. Under the surface of any shutdown confrontation run the subterranean currents of party dynamics, ideological caucuses, donor expectations, district-level pressures, and the ambient noise of social media, where every deviation from maximalist purity is greeted with 1,000 exclamation points. It is precisely because of these pressures that leadership communication must be both architected and resilient. Architected in that it should be built on a scaffold of verifiable commitments, milestones, triggers, contingencies that can withstand the gusts of a churning news cycle. Resilient in that it should bend where prudence dictates and hold where principle demands, explaining the difference as it goes. This is where the Johnson vs. reporter scenario becomes instructive. The reporter's relentless query, will you put a clean measure on the floor? Or will you rule out specific riders that would sink a bipartisan path? Is often read as aggression. In truth, it is a request for a commitment device, a way to make tomorrow's actions legible today. Leaders who resist the bait of personality conflict and instead route the conversation back to instruments, rules, calendars, vote thresholds, cross-chamber reconciliation, conference reports, offer the nation something sturdier than a viral clip, a plan that can be tracked, and plans, unlike postures, have the virtue of falsifiability. If you say you will post bill text by 8 p.m., citizens can check at 8:01. If you promise a vote before close of business Friday, citizens can watch the board. That shared measurability is the antidote to cynicism. It drains the poison from suspicion because it replaces speculation with observation. Yet, transparency alone is not enough. We must also cultivate a habit of explaining trade-offs without condescension. A shutdown fight always contains crisscrossing imperatives: fiscal stewardship, programmatic continuity, policy leverage, and political signaling. Pretending these do not conflict insults the public's intelligence. Pretending they are irreconcilable excuses failure. The adult way through is to narrate the collision and show the craft of piloting between reefs. Say aloud what is being bargained and why. We believe this policy change merits a vote, but not at the cost of interrupting pay for air traffic controllers. Here is how we intend to sequence fights so that leverage is preserved without service disruption. Invite scrutiny from committee chairs and rank-and-file alike, and credit the press when it surfaces blind spots, because blind spots discovered early are better than fiascos discovered late. For their part, journalists should resist the temptation to treat every deviation from a previous sound bite as hypocrisy. Sometimes it is adaptation to new math, new information, or a new offer. From the other chamber, the proper test is coherence. Does the updated position hang together with stated objectives and changed circumstances? Ask that, press that. And when the speaker demonstrates coherence, say so plainly. Credibility must be earned, but it should also be acknowledged when it appears, lest the incentive structure tilt permanently toward performance over governance. Finally, we must remember the deepest audience is not the base, nor the beltway, nor even the press gallery. It is the family deciding whether to postpone a medical appointment because they are unsure if coverage logistics will tangle during a shutdown. It is the park ranger explaining a closed gate to a minivan of kids from out of state. It is the lab manager deciding whether to order reagents amid funding uncertainty. Speak to them concretely, empathetically, with receipts. If a leader cannot do that under pressure, then the office has become a stage, and the Republic loses something it cannot easily replace: the quiet confidence that when the lights are hottest and the clock is harshest, those at the microphones remember whom they serve. If there is a lesson to carry from Mike Johnson vs. Reporter, Shutdown answers under pressure, into our kitchens, classrooms, city halls, and union halls, it is that the habits of a resilient democracy are learned in miniature and practiced in public, especially when the calendar is cruel and the budgets are brittle. We cannot outsource composure or clarity to the people at the microphones. We must cultivate them in ourselves, demanding fact patterns instead of fog, timelines instead of taglines, and trade-off statements instead of triumphal slogans. That starts with a civic posture. Assume complexity without surrendering to it, and assume good faith while verifying relentlessly. When a shutdown looms, do what healthy institutions do. Publish the plain language brief. Share the operating status of services in terms a teenager could explain to a grandparent, and point citizens to the primary documents, bill numbers, committee reports, scorekeeping tables, so that anyone with an internet connection can audit the claims. Leaders should model this by speaking in checkable sentences. On Friday by 6 p.m., we will post the draft continuing resolution. It extends accounts X, Y, and Z to March 15. It includes anomalies A and B. Here is the statutory citation for each exemption. Here is the whip count range and the rule under which we'll bring it to the floor. Reporters should honor that clarity with equally crisp follow-ups that bite on substance. If the Senate amends with C, do you accept or conference? If not, what is your same-day contingency for TSA and Coast Guard pay? Where can viewers see the OMB guidance to agencies? Citizens, for our part, can reward the side that behaves like adults by refusing to share clips that are all heat and no light, by writing our representatives with questions that request specific rather than performative scolding, and by teaching our kids that the difference between a tantrum and a negotiation is that the latter ends with receipts. None of this makes the politics less sharp. It makes the stakes less opaque. Shutdowns should be politically expensive, not because they are rhetorically embarrassing, but because they are operationally indefensible. If a leader really believes that a policy writer is worth halting paychecks, let them say so in numbers and names and dates. If they do not, let them design the sequencing short bridge now. Policy vote next week. That preserves leverage without sacrificing livelihoods. And if a reporter detects drift, let them surface it with chapter and verse, not snark and sneer. The meta-moral is simple. Under pressure, people default to their training, so let's train well. Train leaders to narrate constraints and contingency trees. Train journalists to disentangle theater from throughput. Train citizens to look for document trails and to value the unglamorous grammar of governance. Then the next time the red light atop the camera blinks and a deadline barrels toward midnight, the exchange will feel less like a cage match and more like a service, information in, accountability out, and a public that can tuck its children into bed knowing that grown-ups, however fiercely they disagree, remembered the first job of self-government, to keep the common life running with candor, with competence, and with care.